So today's webinar will be discussing about auto pairing using mesh, as well as using the replacement function on the cloud. Yeah, so first, before showing you guys auto pairing, what is mesh? Just a quick recap. A mesh system is used in place of a wired solution. So traditionally, an access point needs to be wired. Here we have the EWS 360 AP, for example. To use the access point function, it needs to be connected to a switch or to a network. So the function of that connection would be for data connectivity, like if you want to transfer data like the internet or something. Sometimes you can also use that cable to power up the device if your switch is a PoE device. But what if there are some areas wherein we're limited onto where we can lay the cables? Let's say inside a room, the end user does not allow us to drill holes or pull cables inside that room, but they want Wi-Fi connectivity inside. So that's where mesh comes in. So in a mesh solution, you can still have your data running across your network, passing through those APs through a wireless connection or through mesh. So here, instead of using data cables, you basically have a wireless interconnectivity between your access points. So the access points that's connected via the cable, we call those the root node or the gateway. And then you have your mesh nodes, which acts as your sort of like extenders to bridge the data. So another nice thing about mesh is that it's self-healing. That means that if one of your nodes goes off or goes offline, or maybe you get a power cut or something, you will try to find the next available source, the best source to connect back to the network. So that's just a brief summary on mesh. So let me go through the cloud UI just a while. Okay, so how do we implement mesh on the cloud? If you're used to the Easy Master, you'll notice that it's a bit different on how you set up mesh on the cloud system. The way that you do that is first, of course, you have to register your access points, add it on your solution. So now let me add an access point that's not wired on my device. I mean, not wired on my network. I just powered it up using a power adapter. So this is the ECW120. By the way, mesh for the cloud, it doesn't matter what model it is. You can mix models. So here I'll be using the ECW220 as my gateway or my root node. And then my mesh node would be the ECW120. So if you notice, I added it already, but it shows offline because mesh isn't enabled yet. So let me trigger mesh here. So all I need to do is go under my configuration page and then look for radio settings. So from here, if you have mesh activated, you would see this auto pairing button. If you disable mesh here, you won't see that button at all. So enable mesh depending on the situation you are, depending on the environment. But in most cases, you would use 5 gigahertz for your mesh link. So click auto pair. So this would make the access points search for available mesh nodes in the vicinity. So if you have an access point that you just reformatted or just pulled out of the box, assuming that it has fresh settings, your access point will go onto a mesh access point searching mode. Wait, let me show you guys the SSID. So like my ECW120, if you can see this SSID right here, I have N management, then the MAC address, and then MAP listening. So this is your mesh access point, which is listening to the environment. So if I have an AP that I'm already managing right now, and then I click on auto search or search for the mesh connection. So this access point right here that I haven't added on my network yet would listen to that signal. And then once they talk to each other, then it will link together. So it takes about maybe 2 minutes or so for the mesh connection to establish. So let's wait for it to connect. By the way, if you notice, I didn't change any other setting. Let me go back to radio setting. I didn't touch the channel selection is still set to auto. Everything else is set to default. So basically, I just enabled mesh and then hit auto pair. So it's as simple as that. You don't need to do any other pre-configuration if you want to add other mesh devices on your network. Okay, so now the AP is appearing online. It's not yet fully synced because I don't see the mesh modes yet. But once it syncs, it would show you which is the access point, meaning which is the wireless one, and which is the gateway, meaning which is wired on your network. And then from there, we can see more information. Let me try to refresh here. Yeah, so right now, I think it's still trying to sync. Somebody raised a hand. Any questions, guys? Let me check. I see somebody. Tan, do you have a question? You can either talk on the mic or use the chat button. Okay. Anyways, if you guys have any questions later on, I can entertain all your questions. So I'm looking at the status of the AP. It's still syncing here. By the way, if you see the power light button on the physical access point blinking, that means the AP is still configuring itself. So wait a bit before it becomes stable. Once the power light remains steady, that means the access point is ready. So I got some a few information here. If you see the ECW 120, the channel synced with my wired access point. So now it's both on channel 149. In a bit, it should go online already. Okay, just a while, guys. Let me restart my gateway here. Okay, one question while I'm rebooting the access point. One question from Richard. Are there any settings on the ECW 120 that you need to enable for mesh, or does it automatically search for a mesh network? So long as the AP is on the latest firmware, assuming it's out of the box, you just got it from us, then it should have the latest firmware already. So once you power it up using a adapter or an injector, it should automatically search for a mesh network. Okay, bear with me a bit here. I just restarted my gateway. Yeah, so right now I'm using two different models, and I'm using the 220 as my gateway because it gives me more bandwidth to serve the wireless mesh nodes. If you'd use the 120, it's also possible to have the 120 as your gateway, but knowing that the 220 have more bandwidth, then it would be wiser to choose an access point that have more bandwidth as your gateway or your root node. Yeah, restarting the AP usually takes about a minute to power up. And then once it's up, any changes that you make on the setting should take about 30 seconds or so. Okay, the gateway is back up. Let me see if it'll connect to my mesh node. Let me run auto pairing again just to make sure. Okay, so now I see my ECW 120 online, and its mode right now is AP. So the terminology for the cloud is a bit different from the Easy Master. In the Easy Master, we call this the mesh node. Here on the cloud, we call it AP as its mode. And if you hover your mouse over it, you would see more details, such as what radio are we using? So right now we're using 5 gig. The gateway MAC address, the next hop if it's a multi-mesh network, multi-hop network. The RSSI, that means it's connection to the other mesh nodes. So right now I have an RSSI of negative 30. So this is a pretty strong signal, which reflects on the connection status. It tells me that it's way too close on the AP, because right now it's almost like right next to each other. So typical distance from AP to AP, maybe you can set it about 5, 6, or maybe 10 meters apart. It depends on the scenario. But of course, if you have multiple walls in between those access points, your mesh connection may not be able to link back together if there's too much obstruction in between. So the access point should have a reasonable amount of RSSI or connectivity for it to establish the mesh link. Another thing that I want to show you guys is the replace button. So here, next to the access points, I have details, reboot, which would trigger a reboot of the APs. And they have a replace button. So replace here would come in handy if you want to replace an access point. Let's say you want to move it on a different location, or let's say the AP is faulty, and then you want to replace it with another device. So let me unplug my access point right here, and let's try to replace it with another one. By the way, you can only replace a device of the same model. So on my inventory, I have another ECW 220 right here. So I'll use that to replace the other one. So this ECW 220 right here ending with FE, its MAC address. So when I click on replace, let's say I want to replace it with another device. So I'll use this one ending with 1C. And then here it shows me two options. One is to replace, just replace. So your old device would still be kept in your inventory. The second option is, if there's a problem with the hardware, is to replace and deregister for RMA. What that does is, instead of keeping the device on your inventory, it will remove it on your inventory. It will unregister it from the system, so that you can send it back to EnGenius for warranty purposes in case you have any hardware issues. So for this demo, I'll just choose replace. Again, take note of the new AP. Ending MAC address is FB1C. So once I hit replace, it will remove the original access point and replace it with a new one. So you get the success measure right here. My AP is still offline. Let me just remove the 120 to avoid confusion. So now it's currently offline still because it's still booting up. And this is the new replacement MAC address, FB1C. So whatever setting that the old access point had, the one that you're replacing, would be kept here. So you don't need to reconfigure anything. If you want to do RMA, if you want to do replacement on the site, you don't need to reconfigure anything. Basically, you just have to register the new device, click replace, add it in, and that's it. It will then pull the settings that were there, the original settings from the cloud, and download it and apply it on itself. So whatever SSIDs you have, the channel setting, IP setting, and everything, it will be kept as is. So right now, it's already online. If you go into the details, it keeps the same exact setting as is. Your SSID here would be the same. And basically, it speeds up the process of replacing access point, especially if you're, let's say, an MSP or an SI that want to keep your SLA. So this is a very, very good feature to use on the cloud. Okay, let me go to chat. I think some people have a few questions here. Okay, one question is, how can we make sure that the mesh AP connects to our network if having two different ISP on one premise using EnGenius? Okay, let's say you have a network and then you have a set of access points. Uh, when you're on the cloud, you would configure a certain network. Let's say right now here, I'm on my organization, which is Singapore office, and then my network is mesh. So all the APs that belong to mesh would technically be in one network. So if I want to add another AP on this network, which is named mesh, I go to mesh, and then I go to my radio settings and click on auto pair. So here above, I'm sure that I'm still on my mesh network. When I hit auto pair, I'm going to be adding my AP only to this mesh network. So maybe if you have multiple networks, such as here, EnGenius Office, another network for third floor, another network for mesh, just make sure that your uh, path here above is the network where you want to add that access point. Okay, another question here is, can you turn on simultaneously both 2.4 and 5 gig for mesh? Good question. No. So you can only either use 2.4 or 5 gig for your mesh link. So let me show you that right now. If I enable 2.4 here, you would see that 5 gigahertz automatically deactivates. If I select 5, it will only be 2.4. You can turn off mesh, by the way, if you don't need mesh. But it's only one radio at a time. Oh yeah. Also about mesh. Let's say you have a group of APs. Let's say you have 4, 5, 6 APs, but you only need mesh on 2 of them. So here, if you go to the access point, expand it, you have an option here to disable mesh on the specific AP. Let's say 5 of them are wired, and then you have another 2 that you want to mesh. So maybe out of those 5 wired APs, you want to disable mesh on the 4. So all you need to do is click on the specific AP, override the mesh setting, and disable mesh from here. So once you hit apply, this AP would not be used as part of your mesh network. Yeah, since we're on this page, by the way, this is the page where you can override settings on your specific devices. So basically, one network, like my mesh network right here, would carry the same exact settings. If you want to override, let's say, the channel on a certain AP, the power channel width, or let's say you want to disable an SSID on a specific access point, you can do that from here. So, for example, group of 5 APs, uh, 4 of them are broadcasting 5 SSIDs, but one of them you only want it to broadcast one of those SSIDs. So you can enable or disable it from this page. Right now, I only see 2 SSIDs because I only have 2 set up. Any other questions, guys, regarding mesh or replacement or anything about the cloud? I still see 10 raising his hand. Do you have any question? Okay, one question here. Most of my clients using iOS who use other EnGenius and other brand AP has experienced problem due to iOS upgrades. How does NMesh address the dropping of connections? Okay, mesh, basically what meshes is it links access points together via the wireless network. But sometimes we get confused with roaming. So roaming is if you have 2 access points on the same network, and then you're connected to one AP, you move to the other AP, you would still be remain connected because of roaming or fast roaming. Mesh and fast roaming is different from each other, but you can have both enabled simultaneously. Regarding iOS issues in terms of roaming, so long as the phone, the Apple device, iPad, Mac, or uh, iPhones, so long as it's updated, it should have no issues in terms of the connection to our devices. Another question here is, what's the maximum throughput for 2.4 and 5 gig? This would be highly dependent on the model that you have. For example, we have the ECW120, which is a wave 2 access point. So maximum speed for 5 gig is about maximum connection speed is 866 Mbps. 2.4 is 400 Mbps. If I'm going to use a wireless 6 access points, like my ECW220, then my connectivity speed would be higher. So it will all depend on your device. How do we turn on roaming on this APs? Yeah, we're talking about a different topic, but it's okay. I can go over roaming. So if you want to enable roaming, all you need to do is go to your configuration page. You should see your SSID. So under your SSID, this is where you can enable roaming. Let's say I want to use roaming for my first SSID. So I click on that. It will bring me to the wireless page. So here, I would see 802.11r. By default, it's enabled. So 802.11r is one of the standards that's used by fast roaming. Other than that, you have 802.11k and V. So by default, this is enabled. So if you have multiple access points and then you set up an SSID, this SSID would have roaming right away. But if you want to make sure, you can double check. Go to your SSID page, scroll down to 802.11r. Just enable this radio button right here to make sure that you have roaming enabled. By the way, not all devices support roaming. Let's say, for example, older Windows clients, older Windows laptops, they may not be able to support roaming. But if you have a radio server enabled, let's say, for example, you're using the EnGenius radio server, you can still enjoy the roaming function. So, by the way, I hope you guys registered for this webinar. Nancy will talk about later. Basically, because all the registrants on this webinar would be entitled for the lucky draw. If I'm not mistaken, it's a EWS 377 AP. Yeah, so that's our 4x4 Wi-Fi 6 access point. Any other follow-up questions, guys, regarding mesh, or like, let's say you want to know where you can use it? Okay, another question here is, how do we avoid pitfalls of mesh device placements to avoid drops or poor signal? One thing that we advise when designing a Wi-Fi network is to do a site survey beforehand. So let's say, for example, you want to deploy a number of APs on a certain environment, maybe an office network. So it's best to do a site survey. You can do that by maybe bring your laptop or a mobile phone, and then you can use any Wi-Fi analyzer software. So from there, maybe you can bring one or two APs. It's best if you bring at least two. So set up two APs on your uh, planned deployment area, and then from there, try to roam around. Try to see your signal quality, your RSSI, from your client device using your phone or your laptop to the access point. So if you notice that in some areas you get an RSSI level of like negative 80, or lower than that, negative 85, and so on. So that indicates a poor signal already. So maybe you'd either need to increase the throughput power of your access point, or you'd need to deploy more APs. Maybe the area is too big to deploy just two APs. So from there, then you can benchmark how many APs you need for the entire area. For mesh, same thing. Usually negative 80 from AP to AP is pretty weak already. So we might want to keep it at a maximum of negative 75 RSSI between 2 points. Okay, another question here is, wait, let me scroll. Okay, what distance can we establish mesh AP? So yeah, we measure it through the signal quality, or RSSI, not a specific distance in terms of meters or feet, because it's very subjective on the environment. So based on your Wi-Fi survey tool, you can use any tool out there. There's a lot of free software in the market. From there, it would depend. So long as you have at least or at most negative 75, that's the lowest you can get, or that's the lowest you'd want to set it. Or maybe for other situations, you want to set your maximum to negative 70, because beyond that, if you get any interference, your mesh link could break. Is there any log showing that devices roaming from current AP to AP? Yeah. I think your question is regard to client devices. How would you know if the client is roaming from AP to AP? So we're gonna have an update, hopefully by mid-February, maybe around next week, maybe Feb 15 or later on, showing a client timeline feature on the cloud. I can't show it yet. It's not yet ready. It will be ready by then. But basically, the client timeline would show you the path of the client from the moment he first connected until the current status of the client. Let's say he's on the third floor. He roamed to the second floor AP. He moved to the lobby. You would see there, did he roam to another AP, or did he remain in that specific area, and so on and so forth. So from there, you can get more information. You can also extract the logs based on that. Another question here. Let me go through it. NMesh is using 5 gigahertz signal to operate. Is it configurable in terms of transmit power, etc.? Also, does it affect in terms of frequency channels to the Wi-Fi signal on 5 gig? Yeah, good question. So right now I selected 5 gigahertz for my mesh connection, but I can also set it to 2.4. So depending on the environment, if I have too much access points in the area, maybe it's a commercial building. Because right now I set it to auto channel, so I just let the system select what's the best channel to choose for my mesh link or to stick on. But you can also set a static channel for your devices. So if you think that based on your area, it's better to set your APs to a static channel than and the transmit power. If it's best to set it manually, we recommend to do so as well. Then you can do that too. If we or otherwise, you can just set it to auto and let the system decide for you in terms of the mesh signal. What is the trade-off when meshing AP? Does the throughput suffer? Yes, throughput would definitely suffer, but basically, mesh is used as your like your last resort in case you're really not able to. You're not allowed to pull cable to that last mile. So, in order to provide Wi-Fi connectivity in that area, whereas cable is not possible, then you can enable mesh as an alternate option. Will the throughput suffer? Yeah, for both the mesh AP and the gateway, because the access point would transmit data to the mesh device as well as broadcast Wi-Fi signal for normal internet connection as well, or normal data connection. So it's doing two jobs at the same time, but it depending on the device that you have. If you have a bigger bandwidth access point, bigger capacity AP like Wi-Fi 6 devices, then you still have more throughput to play around with. Another question right here. At negative 75, would the throughput still be decent? What would the effective throughput be for a client on the remote mesh AP? This would all depend on the hardware that you're using and your backend speed as well. For example, let's say your ISP speed is only 20 meg, and then your AP's rated capacity is up to 667 Mbps. So even if you mesh your devices together, maybe you can get a throughput of 400 Mbps, but your backhaul is just 20 Mbps, so it's more than enough to support it. But if you have a bigger bandwidth, let's say you're using a 1 gig backhaul from an ISP, then definitely you need a bigger AP to support that. You may not be able to push the full 1 gig on your device on the mesh link if you're using a lower capacity AP, but it will all depend on how much bandwidth that you need in a certain area. Another question here: does 2.4 have a further mesh reach and distance than 5 gig between mesh APs? Yes, 2.4 in general have a longer range as compared to 5 gig, but there are pros and cons. For the 2.4 connection, you have longer range, but because of the limited number of channels, you have more interference on 2.4. So meaning that if you may have longer range, but because of the interference in the area, your throughput could drop um, significantly. On 5 gigahertz, the range is a bit shorter as compared to 2.4, but your throughput is wider, is bigger as well. If you're using Wave 2 APs and Wi-Fi 6 devices, you can see the gap between 2.4 and 5 in terms of throughput is pretty huge. So just like what I said a while ago, but if your back end speed, let's say your ISP speed is not that huge and your AP still support that speed, then in some situations maybe it's better to use 2.4. In other areas, maybe it's better to use 5. So it will all depend on how much throughput you need and how much interference is in the area. If it's a commercial area, I don't advise you use 2.4. If you're deploying like in near the airport or in the airport using 5 gigahertz, I wouldn't advise you mesh using 5 gig as well because there are a lot of frequencies in the airport that utilizes 5 gig. Okay, so we still got time for your questions. So just let me know if you have any questions. Okay, another question here is how do we limit video data across mesh APs? Video data. Okay, right now on our access points we have QoS WMM. Using that type of QoS, it prioritizes certain types of traffic. The highest priority would be voice followed by video. But in terms of limiting video only, we cannot do that specifically on our device. What we can limit is the throughput per user. So if I go into my SSID settings and then I move to the next tab, which is traffic shaping, if I enable this, I have an option to set a download and upload limit. For example, now it's set to 1 MB. If I set it to 1 Mbps per user, I have a ticker here. If I don't check it, this would apply to the whole SSID. If I tick this button right here, it will be applied per individual user. So all the clients connecting to this specific SSID would have a speed cap of 1 Mbps. That means even if I'm just watching YouTube videos continuously or downloading torrent, my speed would be capped at 1 Mbps. So that means it will be limited per user. I wouldn't be hogging the bandwidth for everyone from everyone. If some people are just browsing, let's say emails, browsing the web, and then you're just downloading videos all day, everybody would be kept at 1 Mbps. Maybe this is one way to limit the video data in terms of your question. Yeah. By the way, I mentioned that on mid-February we're gonna have an update on the cloud. So maybe you can have another webinar in terms of what are the contents of that upgrade. Because some of them would contain, I think one of you guys have been asking for it, is basically you can customize the splash page fully. You can fully customize the splash page. So you'd have an editor on this part where you can upload pictures, change the background, modify the text, move around this window, etc. So it will be fully customizable. Another question right here: is there a limit to the maximum meshed APs? I think you're asking based on the how many devices can you mesh together. There's not really a limit, but there's a recommendation that we provide. So here we also have this here just in case. So we recommend to have a maximum 8 access points that are meshed wirelessly, and then not more than 2 hops for the best performance. You can have more, but in the end, your bandwidth will suffer. Maybe if you have like 10 meshed APs and then you have 3 hops, maybe the farthest AP would only be giving the least amount of bandwidth possible. So even if you have all devices that are Wi-Fi 6, but if they're all meshed together and you only have one AP that's wired, maybe the AP would just provide like 1 Mbps or so. Okay, another question. Can we check the signal received from root AP to mesh AP? So yeah, so going back to the access points. Oh, sorry, I unplugged my mesh node already. So here under mesh mode, you would see again the status if it's a mesh AP or a gateway. So gateway is the wired one. If it's set to AP, basically that's your wired device. If you hover over it, it will give you the RSSI level. So that's your signal quality from the mesh AP going back to the gateway or to the other APs that it's linked to. We'll also be adding a topology view for the mesh, which would come later on. That would give you a better visualization on how your mesh network looks like. Okay, another question here is Cloud has a website to change the settings, mostly for SIs to help the client. And the APs are registered under SI account. Okay, go on. Okay, let me attend to the other question first while you're finishing up your question. Is external AAA supported here in Gateway? Yeah, we support third-party radio servers. We also have our own radio server on the cloud, which is built in. So yeah, that will be under Cloud Radius users. If you want to set up a third-party radio server, all you need to do is go under your SSID and then select WPA2 Enterprise or WPA3 Enterprise. Okay, another question is what is the recommended settings for transmit power? Again, when deploying Wi-Fi, usually I would recommend to do a site survey. From your site survey, you can try to estimate how much transmit power you need to cover the area which you want to blanket with Wi-Fi. You don't want it too much to overflow because your Wi-Fi will be spread outside. It's good that you have huge signal coverage, but you also subject your APs to interference. So it's good to set your transmit power just right. There's no specific value because it all depends on the environment, but you can set the transmit power just enough to cover your area that you want to cover with Wi-Fi, and you can test that by doing a site survey using a Wi-Fi analyzer. Another question is what to do when the clients want to access those APs to change the settings on his or her own. Oh, okay. I think the question here is so the SI is managing a certain organization, a certain network on the cloud. And then some users want to manage the same network. So how would you manage that? So here, let's say on my mesh network, I can enable multi-tenancy. So if you see the buttons on the left-hand side, I would have this like two-person silhouette button here. So this is my multi-tenancy. From here, I can see all the members that can manage my network. So if I want to add a new member, let's say I want that person to be an admin or a viewer for my mesh network, so I can just type the email right here to give permission to that person. And then it depends whether you want to give him access so he can configure or access just to view the network. So let's say Milo. So let's say I want to give this person access to my mesh network. I can select either viewer admin here and then apply. So this would send an email to this person giving him access to that network. Okay, another question is for Wi-Fi 6 having 2.5 Gbps and 5 Gbps backbone, is EnGenius coming out with higher bandwidth switches to support? Yeah, very good question. So yeah, our Wi-Fi 6 device, especially the ECW 230, actually has a port of 2.5 Gbps. We're coming up with 2.5 G switches as well as 10 G switches on copper pretty soon. So we'll be announcing that very soon. So hope you guys stay in tune for that. Another question here is what is the difference between WPA3 personal, WPA true, and what is the recommended RSSI? Okay, let me go through my SSIDs. Okay, so what's the difference between this different security type? With the release of Wi-Fi 6, we basically Wi-Fi Alliance also released different authentication methods. If you guys recall WPA2 crack issue before, the hacking issue, basically there's a reason why they came up with WPA3. So WPA3 is a more secure authentication, more secure than WPA2. So that means will it is definitely still hackable, but it takes people more time to hack into it as compared to WPA2. So it makes it more secure. But do take note that not all devices support WPA3 yet. You'd want to look on your device if it supports WPA3 if you want to activate it. So maybe in certain areas that you don't know if majority of the devices support WPA3, you can select WPA3/WPA2. So it could still revert back to WPA2 in case the highest security is not supported by some devices yet. What is the recommended RSSI? In terms of mesh, I would recommend like -75 maximum from AP to AP. Another note here is our SFP 10 gig is supported with 1 gig switches. That's right, Alishan. We have switches that has 1 gigabit ports with 10 gigabit SFP. We're also coming up with copper ports, Ethernet ports that has 2.5G and 10G as well. I think 5G switches are also in the roadmap. So basically, that's your Ethernet connection. Of course, you need to use a cable that supports that speed as well. Okay, maybe I can entertain one more question. Okay, so if no more questions, I think that's about it today. So we'll send you guys reminders again on the next webinar which would happen next week on the same time. So yeah, thank you guys for attending today. In case you have further questions, just send us an email.